Chapter 37 The Catacombs of Saint Sebastian. In his whole life, perhaps, Franz had never before experienced so sudden an impression, so rapid a transition from gaiety to sadness as in this moment. It seemed as though Rome, under the magic breath of some demon of the night, had suddenly changed into a vast tomb. By a chance which added yet more to the intensity of the darkness, the moon, which was on the wane, did not rise until 11 o'clock, and the streets which the young man traversed were plunged in the deepest obscurity. The distance was short, and at the end of 10 minutes his carriage, or rather the Count's, stopped before the Hôtel de Londres. Dinner was waiting, but as Albert had told him that he should not return so soon, Franz sat down without him. Signor Pastrini, who had become accustomed to see them dine together, inquired into the cause of his absence, but Franz merely replied that Albert had received on the previous evening an invitation which he had accepted. The sudden extinction of the Moccolieti, the darkness which had replaced the light, and the silence which had succeeded the turmoil, had left in Franz's mind a certain depression which was not free from uneasiness. He therefore dined very silently, in spite of the officious attention of his host, who presented himself 2 or 3 times to inquire as if he wanted anything. Franz resolved to wait for Albert as late as possible. He ordered the carriage, therefore, for 11 o'clock, desiring Signor Pastrini to inform him the moment that Albert returned to the hostel. Franz resolved to wait for Albert as late as possible. He ordered the carriage, therefore, for 11 o'clock, desiring Signor Pastrini to inform him the moment that Albert returned to the hotel. At 11 o'clock, Albert had not come back. Franz dressed himself and went out, telling his host that he was going to pass the night at the Duke of Bracciano's. The house of the Duke of Bracciano is one of the most delightful in Rome. The Duchess, one of the last heiresses of the Colonnas, does its honours with the most consummate grace, and thus their fêtes have a European celebrity. Franz and Albert had brought to Rome letters of introduction to them, and their first question on his arrival was to inquire the whereabouts of his travelling companion. Franz replied that he had left him at the moment they were about to extinguish the Moccoli, and that he had lost sight of him in the Via Macello. "Then he has not returned," said the Duke. "I waited for him until this hour," replied Franz. "And do you know whither he went?" "No, not precisely. However, I think it was something very like a rendezvous." "Diavolo," said the Duke, "this is a bad day, or rather a bad night, to be out late, is it not, Countess?" These words were addressed to the Countess G., who had just arrived, and was leaning on the arm of Signor Torlonia, the Duke's brother. "I think, on the contrary, that it's a charming night," replied the Countess, "and those who are here will complain of but one thing. It's too rapid flight." "I am not speaking," said the Duke with a smile, "of the persons who are here. The men run no other danger than that of falling in love with you, and the women of falling ill of jealousy at seeing you so lovely. I meant persons who are out in the streets of Rome." "Ah," asked the Countess, "who is out in the streets of Rome at this hour, unless it be to go to a ball?" "Our friend Albert de Morcerf, Countess, whom I left in pursuit of his unknown about 7 o'clock this evening," said Franz, "and whom I have not seen since." "And don't you know where he is?" "Not at all." "Is he armed?" "He is in masquerade." "You should not have allowed him to go," said the Duke to Franz. "You, who know Rome better than he does." "You might as well have tried to stop number 3 of the Barbary, who gained the prize in the race today," replied Franz. "And then, moreover, what could happen to him?" "Who can tell? The night is gloomy, and the Tiber is near the Via Macello." Franz felt a shudder run through his veins at observing the feeling of the Duke, and the Countess was so much in unison with his own personal disquietude. "I informed them at the hotel that I had the honour of passing the night here, Duke," said Franz, "and desired them to come and inform me of his return." "Ah," replied the Duke, "here, I think, is one of my servants who is seeking you." The Duke was not mistaken. When he saw Franz, the servant came up to him. "Your Excellency," he said, "the master of the Hôtel de Londres has sent to let you know that a man is waiting for you with a letter from the Vicomte of Morcerf." "A letter from the Viscount?" exclaimed Franz. "Yes, and who is the man?" "I do not know. Why did he not bring it to me here?" "The messenger did not say." "And where is the messenger?" "He went away directly. He saw me enter the ballroom to find you." "Oh," said the Countess to Franz, "go with all speed. Poor young man. Perhaps some accident has happened to him." "I will hasten," replied Franz. "Shall we see you again to give us any information?" inquired the Countess. "Yes, if it is not any serious affair. Otherwise I cannot answer to what I may do myself." "Be prudent in any event," said the Countess. "Oh, pray be assured of that." Franz took his hat and went away in haste. He had sent away his carriage with orders for it to fetch him at 2 o'clock. Fortunately, the Palazzo Bracciano, which is on one side of the Corso and on the other side of the Square of the Holy Apostles, is hardly 10 minutes' walk from the Hôtel de Londres. As he came near the hotel, Franz saw a man in the middle of the street. He had no doubt that it was the messenger from Albert. The man was wrapped up in a large cloak. He went up to him, but to his extreme astonishment, the stranger first addressed him. "What wants your Excellency of me?" inquired the man, retreating a step or two, as if to keep on his guard. "Are not you the person who brought me a letter?" inquired Franz, "from the Viscount of Morcerf? Your Excellency lodges at Pastrini's hotel?" "I do." "Your Excellency is the travelling companion of the Viscount?" "I am." "Your Excellency's name is the Baron Franz d'Épinay." "Then it is to your Excellency that this letter is addressed." "Is there any answer?" inquired Franz, taking the letter from him. "Yes, your friend at least hopes so." "Come upstairs with me, and I will give it to you." "I prefer waiting here," said the messenger with a smile. "And why?" "Your Excellency will know when you have read the letter." "Shall I find you here, then?" "Certainly." Franz entered the hotel. On the staircase he met Signor Pastrini. "Well?" said the landlord. "Well, what?" responded Franz. "You have seen the man who desired to speak with you from your friend?" he asked of Franz. "Yes, I have seen him," he replied, "and he has handed this letter to me." "Light the candles in my apartment, if you please." The innkeeper gave orders to a servant to go before Franz with a light. The young man had found Signor Pastrini looking very much alarmed, and this had only made him the more anxious to read Albert's letter. And so he went instantly towards the wax light and unfolded it. It was written and signed by Albert. Franz read it twice before he could comprehend what it contained. It was thus worded: "My dear fellow, the moment you have received this, have the kindness to take the letter of credit from my pocket-book, which you will find in the square drawer of the secretary. Add your own to it. If it be not sufficient, run to Torlonia, draw from him instantly 4,000 piastres, and give him to the bearer. It is urgent that I should have this money without delay. I do not say more, relying on you as you may rely on me. Your friend, Albert de Morcerf. P.S. I now believe in Italian banditti." Below these lines were written in a strange hand the following in Italian: "Se al se della mattina le 4.000 piastre non sono nel mi mani, alla 7 il conte Alberto avrà accettato di vivere. Luigi Vampa." If by 6 in the morning the 4,000 piastres are not in my hands, by 7 o'clock the Count Albert will have ceased to live. This second signature explained everything to Franz, who now understood the objection of the messenger to coming up into the apartment. The street was safer for him. Albert then had fallen into the hands of the famous bandit chief, in whose existence he had for so long a time refused to believe. There was no time to lose. He hastened to open the secretary and found the pocket-book in the drawer, and in it the letter of credit. There were in all 6,000 piastres, but of these 6,000 Albert had already expended 3,000. As to Franz, he had no letter of credit, as he lived at Florence and had only come to Rome to pass 7 or 8 days. He had brought but 100 louis, and of these he had not more than 50 left. The 700 or 800 piastres were wanting to them both to make up the sum that Albert required. True, he might in such a case rely on the kindness of Signor Torlonia. He was therefore about to return to the Palazzo Bracciano without loss of time, when suddenly a luminous idea crossed his mind. He remembered the Count of Monte Cristo. Franz was about to ring for Signor Pastrini when that worthy idea presented himself. "My dear sir," he said hastily, "do you know if the Count is within?" "Yes, your Excellency. He has this moment returned." "Is he in bed?" "I should say no." "Then ring at his door, if you please, and request him to be so kind as to give me an audience." Signor Pastrini did as he was desired, and returning 5 minutes after, he said, "The Count awaits your Excellency." Franz went along the corridor, and a servant introduced him to the Count. He was in a small room which Franz had not yet seen, and which was surrounded with divans. The Count came towards him. "Well, what good winds blows you hither at this hour?" said he. "Have you come to sup with me? It would be very kind of you." "No, I have come to speak to you of a very serious matter." "A serious matter," said the Count, looking at Franz with the earnestness usual to him. "And what may it be? Are we alone?" "Yes," replied the Count, going to the door and returning. Franz gave him Albert's letter. "Read that," he said. The Count read it. "Well, well," said he. "Did you see the postscript?" "I did, indeed." "Se al se della mattina le 4 piastre non sono nel mi mana. Alla sette il conte Alberto avrà cessato di vivere. Luigi Vampa." "What think you of that?" inquired Franz. "Have you the money he demands?" "Yes, all but 800 piastres." The Count went to his secretary, opened it, and pulling out a drawer filled with gold, said to Franz, "I hope you will not offend me by applying to you anyone but myself. You see, on the contrary, I come to you first and instantly, and I thank you. Have what you will." And he made a sign to Franz to take what he pleased. "Is it absolutely necessary, then, to send the money to Luigi Vampa?" asked the young man, looking fixedly in his turn at the Count. "Judge for yourselves," replied he. "The postscript is explicit." "I think that if you would take the trouble of reflecting, you could find a way of simplifying the negotiation," said Franz. "How so?" returned the Count with surprise. "If we were to go together to Luigi Vampa, I am sure he would not refuse you Albert's freedom. What influence can I possibly have over a bandit? Have you not just rendered him a service that can never be forgotten?" "What is that?" "Have you not saved Peppino's life?" "Well, well," said the Count, "who told you that?" "No matter, I know it." The Count knit his brows, and remained silent an instant. "And if I went to seek Vampa, would you accompany me, if my society would not be disagreeable?" "Be it so. It's a lovely night, and a walk without Rome will do us both good. Shall I take my arms? For what purpose? Any money? It is useless. Where is the man who brought the letter?" "In the street." "He awaits the answer?" "Yes." "I must learn where we are going. I will summon him hither." "It is useless. He would not come up. To your apartments perhaps, but he will not make any difficulty at entering mine." The Count went to the window of the apartment that looked on the street, and whistled in a peculiar manner. The man in the mantle quitted the wall, and advanced into the middle of the street. "Salite," said the Count, in the same tone in which he would have given an order to his servant. The messenger obeyed without the least hesitation, but rather with alacrity, and mounting the steps at a bound, entered the hotel. 5 seconds afterwards he was at the door of the room. "Ah, it is you, Peppino," said the Count, but Peppino, instead of answering, threw himself on his knees, seized the Count's hand, and covered it with kisses. "Ah," said the Count, "you have then not forgotten that I saved your life." "That is strange, for it is a week ago." "No, Excellency, and never shall I forget it," returned Peppino with an accent of profound gratitude. "Never? That is a long time. But it is something that you believe so. Rise and answer." Peppino glanced anxiously at Franz. "Oh, you may speak before His Excellency," said he. "He is one of my friends." "You allow me to give you this title," continued the Count in French. "It is necessary to excite this man's confidence." "You can speak before me," said Franz. "I am a friend of the Count's." "Good," returned Peppino, I am ready to answer my questions your Excellency may address to me. How did the Viscount Albert fall into Luigi's hands? Excellency, the Frenchman's carriage passed several times the one in which was Teresa, the chief's mistress. Yes, the Frenchman threw her a bouquet. Teresa returned it. All this with the consent of the chief, who was in the carriage. What? Was Luigi Vampa in the carriage with the Roman peasants? Cried Franz. It was he who drove, disguised as the coachman, replied Peppino. Well? Said the Count. Well, then the Frenchman took off his mask. Teresa, with the chief's consent, did the same. The Frenchman asked for a rendezvous. Teresa gave him one. Only, instead of Teresa, it was Beppo who was on the steps of the church of San Giacomo. What? Exclaimed Franz. The peasant girl who snatched his mocoletto from him was a lad of 15, replied Peppino. But it was no disgrace to your friend to have been deceived. Beppo was taken in plenty of others. And Beppo led him outside the walls, said the Count. Exactly so. A carriage was waiting at the end of the Via Macello. Beppo got in, inviting the Frenchman to follow him, and he did not wait to be asked twice. He gallantly offered the right-hand seat to Beppo, and sat by him. Beppo told him he was going to take him to a villa a league from Rome. The Frenchman assured him he would follow him to the end of this world. The coachman went to the Via di Ripetta and the Porta San Paolo, and when they were 200 yards outside, as the Frenchman became somewhat too forward, Beppo put a brace of pistols to his head. The coachman pulled up and did the same. At the same time, 4 of the band, who were concealed on the banks of the Almo, surrounded the carriage. The Frenchman made some resistance and nearly strangled Beppo, but he could not resist 5 armed men, and was forced to yield. They made him get out, walk along the banks of the river, and then brought him to Teresa and Luigi, who were waiting for him in the catacombs of St. Sebastian. Well, said the Count, turning towards Franz, it seems to me that this is a very likely story. What do you say to it? Why, that I should think it very amusing, replied Franz, if it had happened to anyone but poor Albert. And in truth, if you had not found me here, said the Count, it might have proved a gallant adventure, which would have cost your friend dear. But now he is assured his alarm will be the only serious consequence. And shall we go and find him? Inquired Franz. Oh, decidedly, sir. He is in a very picturesque place. Do you know the catacombs of St. Sebastian? I was never in them, but have often resolved to visit them. Well, here is an opportunity made to your hand, and it would be difficult to contrive a better. Have you a carriage? No. That is of no consequence. I always have one ready day and night. Always ready? Yes. I am a very capricious being, and I should tell you that sometimes when I rise, or after my dinner, or in the middle of the night, I resolve on starting for some particular point, and away I go. The Count rang, and a footman appeared. Order out the carriage, he said, and remove the pistols which are in the holsters. You need not waken the coachman. Ali will drive. In a very short time the noise of wheels was heard, and the carriage stopped at the door. The Count took out his watch. 12:30, he said. We might start at 5 o'clock and be in time, but the delay may cause your friend to pass an uneasy night, and therefore we had better go with all speed to extricate him from the hands of the infidels. Are you still resolved to accompany me? More determined than ever. Well then, come along. Franz and the Count went downstairs, accompanied by Peppino. At the door they found the carriage. Ali was on the box, in whom Franz recognized the dumb slave of the grotto of Monte Cristo. Franz and the Count got into the carriage. Peppino placed himself beside Ali, and they set off at a rapid pace. Ali had received his instructions, and went down the Corso, crossed the Campo Vaccino, went up the Strada San Gregorio, and reached the gates of St. Sebastian. Then the porter raised some difficulties, but the Count of Monte Cristo produced a permit from the governor of Rome, allowing him to leave or enter the city at any hour of the day or night. The portcullis was therefore raised. The porter had a louis for his trouble, and then went on their way. The road which the carriage now traversed was the ancient Appian Way, and bordered with tombs. From time to time, by the light of moon which began to rise, Franz imagined that he saw something like a sentinel appear at various points among the ruins, and suddenly retreat into the darkness on a signal from Peppino. A short time before they reached the baths of Caracalla, the carriage stopped. Peppino opened the door, and the Count and the Franz alighted. "In 10 minutes," said the Count to his companion, "we shall be there." He then took Peppino aside, gave him an order in a low voice, and Peppino went away, taking with him a torch brought with them in the carriage. 5 minutes elapsed, during which Franz saw the shepherd going along a narrow path that led over the irregular and broken surface of the Campagna, and finally he disappeared in the midst of the tall red herbage, which seemed like the bristling mane of an enormous lion. "Now," said the Count, "let us follow him." Franz and the Count in their turn then advanced along the same path, which at the distance of 100 paces led them over a declivity to the bottom of a small valley. They then perceived 2 men conversing in the obscurity. "Ought we to go on?" asked Franz the Count, "or shall we wait a while?" "Let us go on. Peppino will have warned the sentry of our coming." One of the 2 men was Peppino, and the other a bandit on the lookout. Franz and the Count advanced, and the bandit saluted them. "Your Excellency," said Peppino, addressing the Count, "if you will follow me, the opening of the catacombs is close at hand." "Go on, then," replied the Count. They came to an opening behind a clump of bushes and in the midst of a pile of rocks, by which a man could scarcely pass. Peppino glided first into this crevice. After they got along a few paces, the passage widened. Peppino passed, lighted his torch, and turned to see if they came after him. The Count first reached an open space, and Franz followed him closely. The passageway sloped in a gentle descent, enlarging as they proceeded. Still, Franz and the Count were compelled to advance in a stooping posture, and were scarcely able to proceed abreast of one another. They went on 150 paces in this way, and then were stopped by. "Who comes there?" At the same time they saw the reflection of a torch on a carbine barrel. "A friend," responded Peppino, and advancing alone towards the sentry, he said a few words to him in a low tone, and then he, like the first, saluted the nocturnal visitors, making a sign that they might proceed. Behind the sentinel was a staircase with 20 steps. Franz and the Count descended these, and found themselves in a mortuary chamber. 5 corridors diverged like the rays of a star, and the walls dug into niches, which were arranged one above the other in the shape of coffins, showed that they were at last in the catacombs. Down one of the corridors, whose extent it was impossible to determine, rays of light were visible. The Count laid his hand on Franz's shoulder. "Would you like to see a camp of bandits in repose?" he inquired. "Exceedingly," replied Franz. "Come with me." Then Peppino put out the torch. Peppino obeyed, and Franz and the Count were in utter darkness, except that 50 paces in advance of them a reddish glare, more evident since Peppino had put out his torch, was visible along the wall. They advanced silently, the Count guiding Franz, as if he had the singular faculty of seeing in the dark. Franz himself, however, saw his way more plainly in proportion as he went on towards the light, which served him in some manner as a guide. 3 arcades were before them, and the middle one was used as a door. These arcades opened on one side into the corridor where the Count and the Franz were, and on the other into a large square chamber, entirely surrounded by niches similar to those of which we have spoken. In the midst of this chamber were 4 stones, which had formerly served as an altar, as was evident from the cross which still surmounted them. A lamp placed at the base of a pillar lighted up with its pale and flickering flame the singular scene which presented itself to the eyes of the 2 visitors concealed in the shadow. A man was seated with his elbow leaning on the column, and was reading with his back turned to the arcades, through the openings of which the newcomers contemplated him. This was the chief of the band, Luigi Vampa. Around him, and in groups, according to their fancy, lying in their mantles or with their backs against a sort of stone bench which went all around the columbarium, were to be seen 20 brigands or more, each having his carbine within reach. At the other end, silent, scarcely visible, and like a shadow, was a sentinel who was walking up and down before a grotto, which was only distinguishable because in that spot the darkness seemed more dense than elsewhere. When the Count thought Franz had gazed sufficiently on this picturesque tableau, he raised his finger to his lips to warn him to be silent, and ascended the 3 steps which led to the corridor of the columbarium, entered the chamber by the middle arcade, and advanced towards Vampa, who was so intent on the book before him that he did not hear the noise of his footsteps. "Who comes there?" cried the sentinel, who was less abstracted, and who saw by the lamplight a shadow approaching his chief. At this challenge, Vampa rose quickly, drawing at the same moment a pistol from his girdle. In a moment all the bandits were on their feet, and 20 carbines were levelled at the Count. "Well," said he in a voice perfectly calm, and no muscle of his countenance disturbed. "Well, my dear Vampa, it appears to me that you receive a friend with a great deal of ceremony." "Ground arms!" exclaimed the chief, with an imperative sign of the hand, while with the other he took off his hat respectfully. Then turning to the singular personage who had caused this scene, he said, "Your pardon, your Excellency, but I was so far from expecting the honour of a visit that I did not really recognize you." "It seems that your memory is equally short in everything, Vampa," said the Count, "and that not only do you forget people's faces, but also the conditions you make with them." "What conditions have I forgotten, your Excellency?" inquired the bandit, with the air of a man who, having committed an error, is anxious to repair it. "Was it not agreed," asked the Count, "that not only my person, but also that of my friends, should be respected by you?" "And how have I broken that treaty, your Excellency?" "You have this evening carried off and conveyed hither the Vicomte Albert de Morcerf." "Well," continued the Count, in a tone that made Franz shudder, "this young gentleman is one of my friends. This young gentleman lodges in the same hotel as myself. This young gentleman has been up and down the Corso for 8 hours in my private carriage, and yet, I repeat to you, you have carried him off and conveyed him hither, and," added the Count, taking the letter from his pocket, "you have set a ransom on him, as if he were utter stranger." "Why did you not tell me all this, you?" inquired the brigand chief, turning towards his men, who all retreated before his look. "Why have you caused me thus to fail in my word towards a gentleman like the Count, who has all your lives in his hands? By heavens, if I thought one of you knew that the young gentleman was a friend of his Excellency, I would blow his brains out with my own hand." "Well," said the Count, turning towards Franz, "I told you there was some mistake in this." "Are you not alone?" asked Vampa with uneasiness. "I am with the person to whom this letter was addressed, and to whom I desired to prove that Luigi Vampa was a man of his word. Come, your Excellency," the Count added, turning to Franz, "here is Luigi Vampa, who will himself express to you his deep regret at the mistake he has committed." Franz approached, the chief advancing several steps to meet him. "Welcome among us, your Excellency," he said to him. "You heard what the Count just said, and also my reply. Let me add that I would not for the 4,000 piastres at which I had fixed your friend's ransom that this had happened." "But," said Franz, looking around him uneasily, "where is the Viscount? I do not see him." "Nothing has happened to him, I hope," said the Count frowningly. "The prisoner is there," replied Vampa, pointing to the hollow space in front of which the bandit was on guard, "and I will go myself and tell him he is free." The chief went towards the place he had pointed out as Albert's prison, and Franz and the Count followed him. "What is the prisoner doing?" inquired Vampa of the sentinel. "Ma foi, captain," replied the sentry, "I do not know. For the last hour I have not heard him stir." "Come in, your Excellency," said Vampa. The Count and Franz ascended 7 or 8 steps after the chief, who drew back a bolt and opened a door. Then by the gleam of a lamp, similar to that which lighted the columbarium, Albert was to be seen wrapped up in a cloak, which one of the bandits had lent him, lying in a corner in profound slumber. "Come," said the Count, smiling with his own peculiar smile. "Not so bad for a man who is to be shot at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Vampa looked at Albert with a kind of admiration. He was not insensible to such proof of courage. "You are right, your Excellency," he said. "This must be one of your friends." Then going to Albert, he touched him on the shoulder, saying, "Will your Excellency please to awaken?" Albert stretched out his arms, rubbing his eyelids, and opened his eyes. "Oh," said he, "is it you, Captain? You should have allowed me to sleep. I had such a delightful dream. I was dancing to the galop at Tolonia's with the Countess G." Then he drew his watch from his pocket, that he might see how time sped. "1:30 only," said he. "Why the devil do you rouse me at this hour?" "To tell you that you are free, Your Excellency." "My dear fellow," replied Albert with perfect ease of mind, "remember for the future Napoleon's maxim, 'Never awaken me but for bad news.' If you had let me sleep on, I should have finished my gallop, and have been grateful to you all my life. So then, they have paid my ransom." "No, Your Excellency." "Well, then how am I free?" "A person to whom I can refuse nothing has come to demand you." "Come hither." "Yes, hither." "Really? Then that person is a most amiable person." Albert looked around and perceived Franz. "What?" said he. "Is it you, my dear Franz, whose devotion and friendship are thus displayed?" "No, not I," replied Franz, "but our neighbor, the Count of Monte Cristo." "Oh, my dear Count," said Albert gaily, arranging his cravat and wristbands, "you are really most kind, and I hope you will consider me as under eternal obligations to you, and in the first place for the carriage, and in the next for this visit." And he put out his hand to the Count, who shuddered as he gave his own, but who nevertheless did give it. The bandit gazed on this scene with amazement. He was evidently accustomed to see his prisoners tremble before him, and yet here was one whose gay temperament was not for a moment altered. As for Franz, he was enchanted at the way in which Albert had sustained the national honor in the presence of the bandit. "My dear Albert," he said, "if you will make haste, you shall yet have time to finish the night at Torlonia's. You may conclude your interrupted gallop, so that you will owe no ill will to Signor Luigi, who has indeed throughout this whole affair acted like a gentleman." "You are decidedly right, and we may reach the Palazzo by 2 o'clock, Signor Luigi," continued Albert. "Is there any formality to fulfill before I take leave of your Excellency?" "None, sir," replied the bandit. "You are as free as air." "Well, then, a happy and merry life to you. Come, gentlemen, come." And Albert, followed by Franz and the Count, descended the staircase, crossed the square chamber, where stood all the bandits hat in hand. "Peppino," said the brigand chief, "give me the torch." "What are you going to do?" inquired the Count. "I will show you the way back myself," said the captain. "That is the least honor that I can render to your Excellency." And taking the lighted torch from the hands of the herdsman, he preceded his guests, not as a servant who performs an act of civility, but like a king who precedes ambassadors. On reaching the door, he bowed. "And now, your Excellency," added he, "allow me to repeat my apologies, and I hope you will not entertain any resentment at what has occurred." "No, my dear Vampa," replied the Count. "Besides, you compensate for your mistakes in so gentlemanly a way that one almost feels obliged to you for having committed them. Gentlemen," added the chief, turning towards the young men, "perhaps the offer may not appear very tempting to you, but if you should ever feel inclined to pay me a second visit, wherever I may be, you shall be welcome." Franz and Albert bowed. The Count went out first, then Albert. Franz paused for a moment. "Has your Excellency anything to ask me?" said Vampa with a smile. "Yes, I have," replied Franz. "I am curious to know what work you were perusing with so much attention as we entered." "Caesar's Commentaries," said the bandit. "It's my favorite work." "Well, are you coming?" asked Albert. "Yes," replied Franz. "Here I am," and he, in his turn, left the caves. They advanced to the plain. "Ah, your pardon," said Albert, turning around. "Will you allow me, Captain?" And he lighted his cigar at Vampa's torch. "Now, my dear Count," he said, "let us on with all the speed we may. I am enormously anxious to finish my night at the Duke of Bracciano's." They found the carriage where they had left it. The Count said a word in Arabic to Ali, and horses went on at great speed. It was just 2 o'clock by Albert's watch when the two friends entered the dancing-room. Their return was quite an event, but as they entered together, all uneasiness on Albert's account ceased instantly. "Madame," said the Viscount of Morcerf, advancing towards the Countess, "yesterday you were so condescending as to promise me a gallop. I am rather late in claiming this gracious promise, but here is my friend, whose character for veracity you well know, and he will assure you the delay arose from no fault of mine." And at this moment the orchestra gave the signal for the last waltz. Albert put his arm around the waist of the Countess, and disappeared with her in the whirl of dancers. In the meanwhile, Franz was considering the singular shudder that had passed over the Count of Monte Cristo at the moment when he had been, in some sort, forced to give his hand to Albert.
This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns, Concord, New Hampshire. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 38. The Compact. The first words that Albert uttered to his friend on the following morning contained a request that Franz would accompany him on a visit to the Count. True, the young man had warmly and energetically thanked the Count on the previous evening, but services such as he had rendered could never be too often acknowledged. Franz, who seemed attracted by some invisible influence towards the Count, in which terror was strangely mingled, felt an extreme reluctance to permit his friend to be exposed alone to the singular fascination that this mysterious personage seemed to exercise over him, and therefore made no objection to Albert's request, but at once accompanied him to the desired spot, and after a short delay the Count joined them in the salon. "My dear Count," said Albert, advancing to meet him, "permit me to repeat the poor thanks I offered last night, and to assure you that the remembrance of all I owe to you will never be effaced from my memory. Believe me, as long as I live, I shall never cease to dwell with grateful recollection on the prompt and important service you rendered me, and also to remember that to you I am indebted even for my life." "My very good friend and excellent neighbor," replied the Count with a smile, "you really exaggerate my trifling exertions. You owe me nothing but some trifle of 20,000 francs, which you have been saved out of your travelling expenses, so that there is not much of a score between us. But you must really permit me to congratulate you on the ease and unconcern with which you resigned yourself to your fate, and the perfect indifference you manifested as to the turn events might take." "Upon my word," said Albert, "I deserve no credit for what I could not help, namely, a determination to take everything as I found it, and to let those bandits see that although men get into troublesome scrapes all over the world, there is no nation but the French that can smile even in the face of grim death himself. All that, however, has nothing to do with my obligations to you, and I now come to ask you whether, in my own person, my family, or connections, I can in any way serve you. My father, the Comte de Morcerf, although of Spanish origin, possesses considerable influence both at the court of France and Madrid, and I unhesitatingly place the best services of myself and all to whom my life is dear at your disposal." "Monsieur de Morcerf," replied the Count, "your offer, far from surprising me, is precisely what I expected from you, and I accept it in the same spirit of hearty sincerity with which it is made. Nay, I will go still further, and say that I had previously made up my mind to ask a great favor at your hands." "Oh, pray name it." "I am wholly a stranger to Paris. It is a city I have never yet seen." "Is it possible," exclaimed Albert, "that you have reached your present age without visiting the finest capital in the world? I can scarcely credit it." "Nevertheless, it is quite true. Still, I agree with you in thinking that my present ignorance of the first city in Europe is a reproach to me in every way, and calls for immediate correction. But, in all probability, I should have performed so important, so necessary a duty as that of making myself acquainted with the wonders and beauties of your justly celebrated capital, had I known any person who would have introduced me into the fashionable world, but unfortunately I possessed no acquaintance there, and of necessity was compelled to abandon the idea." "So distinguished an individual as yourself," cried Albert, "could scarcely have required an introduction." "You are most kind. But as regards myself, I can find no merit I possess, save that, as a millionaire, I might have become a partner in the speculations of Monsieur Aguado and Monsieur Rothschild. But as my motive in traveling to your capital would not have been for the pleasure of dabbling in stocks, I stayed away till some favorable chance could present itself of carrying my wish into execution." "Your offer, however, smooths all difficulties, and I have only to ask you, my dear Monsieur de Morcerf," these words were accompanied by a most peculiar smile, "whether you undertake, upon my arrival in France, to open to me the doors of that fashionable world of which I know no more than a Huron or a native of Cochin China." "Oh, that I do, and with infinite pleasure," answered Albert, "and so much the more readily as a letter received this morning from my father summons me to Paris, in consequence of a treaty of marriage. My dear Franz, do not smile, I beg of you. With a family of high standing, and connected with the very cream of Parisian society." "Connected by marriage, you mean," said Franz, laughingly. "Well, never mind how it is," answered Albert. "It comes to the same thing in the end. Perhaps by the time you return to Paris, I shall be quite a sober, staid father of a family. A most edifying representative I shall make of all the domestic virtues. Don't you think so? But as regards your wish to visit our fine city, my dear Count, I can only say that you may command me and mine to any extent you please." "Then it is settled," said the Count, "and I give you my solemn assurance that I only waited an opportunity like the present to realize plans that I have long meditated." Franz did not doubt that these plans were the same concerning which the Count had dropped a few words in the grotto of Monte Cristo, and while the Count was speaking, the young man watched him closely, hoping to read something of his purpose in his face. But his countenance was inscrutable, especially when, as in the present case, it is veiled in a sphinx-like smile. "But tell me now, Count," exclaimed Albert, delighted at the idea of having to chaperone so distinguished a person as Monte Cristo, "tell me truly whether you are in earnest, or if this project of visiting Paris is merely one of the chimerical and uncertain air-castles of which we make so many in the course of our lives, but which, like a house built on the sand, is liable to be blown over by the first puff of wind." "I pledge you my honor," returned the Count, "that I mean to do as I have said. Both inclination and positive necessity compel me to visit Paris." "When do you propose going thither?" "Have you made up your mind when you shall be there yourself?" "Certainly I have. In a fortnight or 3 weeks' time, that is to say, as fast as I can get there." "Nay," said the Count, "I will give you 3 months ere I join you. You see, I make an ample allowance for all delays and difficulties." "And in 3 months' time," said Albert, "you will be at my house?" "Shall we make a positive appointment for a particular day and hour?" inquired the Count. "Only let me warn you that I am proverbial for my punctilious exactitude in keeping my engagements." "Day for day, hour for hour," said Albert. "That will suit me to a dot." "So be it, then," replied the Count, and extending his hand toward a calendar, suspended near the chimney-piece, he said, "Today is the 21st of February," and drawing out his watch added, "It is exactly 10:30. Now promise me to remember this, and expect me the 21st of May, at the same hour in the forenoon." "Capital!" exclaimed Albert. "Your breakfast shall be waiting." "Where do you live?" "No. 27, Rue du Helder." "Have you bachelor's apartments there? I hope my coming will not put you to any inconvenience." "I reside in my father's house, but occupy a pavilion at the farther side of the courtyard, entirely separated from the main building." "Quite sufficient," replied the Count, as, taking out his tablets, he wrote down No. 27, Rue du Helder, 21st May, 10:30 in the morning. "Now then," said the Count, returning his tablets to his pocket, "make yourself perfectly easy. The hand of your timepiece will not be more accurate in marking the time than myself." "Shall I see you again ere my departure?" asked Albert. "That depends. When do you leave?" "Tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock." "In that case I must say adieu to you, as I am compelled to go to Naples, and shall not return thither before Saturday evening or Sunday morning. And you, Baron," pursued the Count, addressing Franz, "do you also depart tomorrow?" "Yes." "For France?" "No, for Venice. I shall remain in Italy for another year or two." "Then we shall not meet in Paris?" "I fear I shall not have that honor." "Well, since we must part," said the Count, holding out a hand to each of the young men. "Allow me to wish you both a safe and pleasant journey." It was the first time the hand of Franz had come in contact with that of the mysterious individual before him, and unconsciously he shuddered at its touch, for it felt cold and icy as that of a corpse. "Let us understand each other," said Albert. "It is agreed, is it not, that you are to be at number 27 in the Rue du Helder on the 21st of May at 10:30 in the morning, and your word of honor passed for your punctuality?" "The 21st of May at 10:30 in the morning, Rue du Helder, number 27," replied the count. The young men then rose, and bowing to the count, quitted the room. "What is the matter?" asked Albert of Franz, when they had returned to their own apartments. "You seem more than commonly thoughtful." "I will confess to you, Albert," replied Franz, "the count is a very singular person, and the appointment you have made to meet him in Paris fills me with 1,000 apprehensions." "My dear fellow," exclaimed Albert, "what can there possibly be in that to excite uneasiness? Why, you must have lost your senses." "Whether I am in my senses or not," answered Franz, "that is the way I feel." "Listen to me, Franz," said Albert. "I am glad that the occasion has presented itself for saying this to you, for I have noticed how cold you are in your bearing towards the count, while he, on the other hand, has always been courtesy itself to us. Have you anything particular against him?" "Possibly." "Did you ever meet him previously to coming hither?" "I have." "And where?" "Will you promise not to repeat a single word of what I am about to tell you?" "I promise." "Upon your honor?" "Upon my honor." "Then listen to me." Franz then related to his friend the history of his excursion to the island of Monte Cristo, and of finding a party of smugglers there, and the 2 Corsican bandits with them. He dwelt with considerable force and energy on the almost magical hospitality he had received from the count, and the magnificence of his entertainment in the grotto of the 1001 Nights. He recounted with circumstantial exactitude all the particulars of the supper, the hashish, the statues, the dream, and how, at his awakening, there remained no proof or trace of all these events, save the small yacht, seen in the distant horizon, driving under full sail toward Porto Vecchio. Then he detailed the conversation overheard by him at the Colosseum, between the count and Vampa, in which the count had promised to obtain the release of the bandit Peppino, an engagement which, as our readers are aware, he most faithfully fulfilled. At last he arrived at the adventure of the preceding night, and the embarrassment in which he found himself placed by not having sufficient cash by 600 or 700 piastres to make up the sum required, and finally of his application to the count, and the picturesque and satisfactory result that followed. Albert listened with the most profound attention. "Well," said he, when Franz had concluded, "what do you find to object to in all you have related? The count is fond of traveling, and being rich, possesses a vessel of his own. Go but to Portsmouth or Southampton, and you will find the harbors crowded with the yachts belonging to such of the English as can afford the expense, and have the same liking for this amusement. Now, by way of having a resting place during his excursions, avoiding the wretched cookery, which has been trying its best to poison me during the last 4 months, while you have manfully resisted its effects for many years, and obtaining a bed on which it is possible to slumber, Monte Cristo has furnished for himself a temporary abode where you first found him. But to prevent the possibility of the Tuscan government taking a fancy to his enchanted palace, and thereby depriving him of the advantages naturally expected from so large an outlay of capital, he has wisely enough purchased the island, taking its name. Just ask yourself, my good fellow, whether there are not many persons of our acquaintance who assume the names of lands and properties they never in their lives are masters of." "But," said Franz, "the Corsican bandits that were among the crew of his vessel?" "Why, really the thing seems to me simple enough. Nobody knows better than yourself that the bandits of Corsica are not rogues or thieves, but purely and simply fugitives, driven by some sinister motive from their native town or village, and that their fellowship involves no disgrace or stigma. For my own part, I protest that, should I ever go to Corsica, my first visit, ere even I presented myself to the mayor or prefect, should be to the bandits of Colomba, if I could only manage to find them, for, on my conscience, they are a race of men I admire greatly." "Still," persisted Franz, "I suppose you will allow that such men as Vampa and his band are regular villains, who have no other motive than plunder when they seize your person. How do you explain the influence the count evidently possessed over these ruffians?" "My good friend, as in all probability I owe my present safety to that influence, it would ill become me to search too closely into its source. Therefore, instead of condemning him for his intimacy with outlaws, you must give me leave to excuse any little irregularity there may be in such a connection, not altogether for preserving my life, for my own idea was that it never was in much danger, but certainly for saving me 4,000 piastres, which, being translated, means neither more nor less than 24,000 livres of our money, a sum at which, most assuredly, I should never have been estimated in France; proving most indisputably," added Albert with a laugh, "that no prophet is honored in his own country." "Talking of countries," replied Franz, "of what country is the count? What is his native tongue? Whence does he derive his immense fortune? And what were those events of his early life, a life as marvelous as unknown, that have tinctured his succeeding years with so dark and gloomy a misanthropy?" "Certainly, these are questions that, in your place, I should like to have answered." "My dear Franz," replied Albert, "when upon receipt of my letter you found the necessity of asking the count's assistance, you promptly went to him, saying, 'My friend Albert de Morcerf is in danger; help me to deliver him.' Was not that nearly what you said?" "It was." "Well, then, did he ask you, 'Who is Monsieur Albert de Morcerf? How does he come by his name, his fortune? What are his means of existence? What is his birthplace? Of what country is he a native? Tell me, did he put all these questions to you?" "I confess he asked me none." "No, he merely came and freed me from the hands of Signor Vampa, where, I can assure you, in spite of all my outward appearance of ease and unconcern, I did not very particularly care to remain. Now then, Franz, when, for services so promptly and unhesitatingly rendered, he would ask me in return to do for him what is done daily for any Russian prince or Italian nobleman who may pass through Paris, merely to introduce him into society, would you have me refuse? My good fellow, you must have lost your senses to think it possible I could act with such cold-blooded policy." And this time it must be confessed that, contrary to the usual state of affairs in discussions between the young men, the effective arguments were all on Albert's side. "Well," said Franz with a sigh, "do as you please, my dear Viscount, for your arguments are beyond my powers of refutation. Still, in spite of all, you must admit that this Count of Monte Cristo is a most singular personage." "He is a philanthropist," answered the other, "and no doubt his motive in visiting Paris is to compete for the Monthion prize, given, as you are aware, to whoever shall be proved to have most materially advanced the interests of virtue and humanity. If my vote and interest can obtain it for him, I will readily give him the one and promise the other. And now, my dear Franz, let us talk of something else. Come, shall we take our luncheon, and then pay a last visit to St. Peter's?" Franz silently assented, and the following afternoon, at 5:30, the young men parted. Albert de Morcerf returned to Paris, and Franz d'Épinay to pass a fortnight at Venice; but ere he entered his traveling carriage, Albert, fearing that his expected guest might forget the engagement he had entered into, placed in the care of the waiter at the hotel a card, to be delivered to the Count of Monte Cristo, on which, beneath the name of Vicomte Albert de Morcerf, he had written in pencil, 27 Rue du Helder, on the 21st May, 10:30 a.m. End of chapter 38. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns, Concord, New Hampshire, October 14th, 2007. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 39. The Guests. In the house in the Rue de Helder, where Albert had invited the Count of Monte Cristo, everything was being prepared on the morning of the 21st of May to do honor to the occasion. Albert de Morcerf inhabited a pavilion situated at the corner of a large court, and directly opposite another building in which were the servants' apartments. 2 windows only of the pavilion faced the street. 3 other windows looked into the court, and 2 at the back into the garden. Between the court and the garden, built in the heavy style of the imperial architecture, was a large and fashionable dwelling of the Count and Countess de Morcerf. A high wall surrounded the whole of the hotel, surmounted at intervals by vases filled with flowers, and broken in the center by a large gate of gilded iron, which served as a carriage entrance. A small door, close to the lodge of the concierge, gave ingress and egress to the servants and masters when they were on foot. It was easy to discover that the delicate care of a mother, unwilling to part from her son, and yet aware that a young man of the Viscount's age required the full exercise of his liberty, had chosen this habitation for Albert. There were not lacking, however, evidences of what we may call the intelligent egoism of a youth who is charmed with the indolent, careless life of an only son, and who lives, as it were, in a gilded cage. By means of the 2 windows looking into the street, Albert could see all that passed. The sight of what is going on is necessary to young men, who always want to see the world traverse the horizon, even if that horizon is only a public thoroughfare. Then, should anything appear to merit a more minute examination, Albert de Morcerf could follow up his researches by means of a small gate, similar to that close to the concierge's door, and which merits a particular description. It was a little entrance that seemed never to have been opened since the house was built, so entirely was it covered with dust and dirt, but the well-oiled hinges and locks told quite another story. The door was a mockery to the concierge, from whose vigilance and jurisdiction it was free, and like that famous portal in the Arabian Nights, opening at the sesame of Ali Baba, it was wont to swing backward at a cabalistic word, or a concerted tap from without, from the sweetest voices or whitest fingers in the world. At the end of a long corridor, with which the door communicated, and which formed the antechamber, was on the right Albert's breakfast room, looking into the court, and on the left the salon, looking into the garden. Shrubs and creeping plants covered the windows, and hid from the garden and court these 2 apartments, the only rooms into which, as they were on the ground floor, the prying eyes of the curious could penetrate. On the floor above were similar rooms, with the addition of a third, formed out of the antechamber. These 3 rooms were a salon, a boudoir, and a bedroom. The salon downstairs was only an Algerian divan, for the use of smokers. The boudoir upstairs communicated with the bedchamber by an invisible door on the staircase. It was evident that every precaution had been taken. Above this floor was a large atelier, which had been increased in size by pulling down the partitions, a pandemonium, in which the artist and the dandy strove for preeminence. There were collected and piled up all Albert's successive caprices: hunting horns, bass viols, flutes, a whole orchestra. For Albert had had not a taste but a fancy for music. Easels, palettes, brushes, pencils, for music had been succeeded by painting. Foils, boxing gloves, broadswords, and single-sticks. For following the example of the fashionable young men of the time, Albert de Morcerf cultivated, with far more perseverance than music and drawing, the 3 arts that complete a dandy's education, for example, fencing, boxing, and single-stick, and it was here that he received Grisier, Cook, and Charles Le Boucher. The rest of the furniture of this privileged apartment consisted of old cabinets, filled with Chinese porcelain and Japanese vases, Luca della Robbia, faience, and Palissy platters, of old armchairs, in which perhaps had sat Henry IV., or Sully, Louis XIII., or Richelieu. For 2 of these armchairs, adorned with a carved shield, on which were engraved the fleur-de-lis of France, on an azure field, evidently came from the Louvre, or at least some royal residence. Over these dark and sombre chairs were thrown splendid stuffs, dyed beneath Persia's sun, or woven by the fingers of the women of Calcutta or of Chandernagore. What these stuffs did there, it was impossible to say. They awaited, while gratifying the eyes, a destination unknown to their owner himself. In the meantime they filled the place with their golden and silky reflections. In the centre of the room was a roller and Blanchette baby grand piano in rosewood, but holding the potentialities of an orchestra in its narrow and sonorous cavity, and groaning beneath the weight of a chefs d'oeuvre of Beethoven, Weber, Mozart, Haydn, Grétry, and Porpora. On the walls, over the doors, on the ceiling, were swords, daggers, mallet creeses, maces, battle axes, gilded damasks and inlaid suits of armor, dried plants, minerals, and stuffed birds, their flame-colored wings outspread in motionless flight, and the beaks forever open. This was Albert's favorite lounging place. However, the morning of the appointment, the young man had established himself in the small salon downstairs. There, on a table, surrounded at some distance by a large and luxurious divan, every species of tobacco known, from the yellow tobacco of Petersburg to the black of Sinai, and so on along the scale from Maryland to Puerto Rico, Latakia, was exposed in pots of crackled earthenware, of which the Dutch were so fond. Beside them, in boxes of fragrant wood, were ranged, according to their size and quality, puros, regalias, Havanas, and Manilas, and in an open cabinet a collection of German pipes, of chibouks, with their amber mouthpieces ornamented with coral, and of narghiles, with their long tubes of Morocco, awaiting the caprice or the sympathy of the smokers. Albert had himself presided at the arrangement, or rather the symmetrical derangement, which, after coffee, the guests at a breakfast in modern days love to contemplate through the vapour that escapes from their mouths, and descends in long and fanciful wreaths to the ceiling. At 9:45, a valet entered. He composed with a little groom named John, and who spoke only English, all Albert's establishment, although the cook of the hotel was always at his service, and on great occasion the Count Sacher also. This valet, whose name was Germain, and who enjoyed the entire confidence of his young master, held in one hand a number of papers, and in the other a packet of letters, which he gave to Albert. Albert glanced carelessly at the different missives, selected two written in a small and delicate hand, and, enclosed in scented envelopes, opened them and perused their contents with some attention. "How did these letters come?" said he. "One by the post. Madame Danglars' footman left the other." "Let Madame Danglars know that I accept the place she offers me in her box. Wait. Then, during the day, tell Rosa that when I leave the opera I will sup with her as she wishes. Take her 6 bottles of different wine, Cyprus, sherry, and Malaga, and a barrel of Ostend oysters. Get them at Borel's, and be sure to say they are from me. At what o'clock, sir, do you breakfast?" "What time is it now?" 9:45. "Very well. At 10:30, Debray will, perhaps, be obliged to go to the minister, and besides—" Albert looked at his tablets. "It is the hour I told the Count, 21st May, at 10:30, and though I do not much rely on his promise, I wish to be punctual. Is the Countess up yet?" "If you wish, I will inquire." "Yes. Ask her for one of her liqueur célérettes. Mine is incomplete. And tell her I shall have the honor of seeing her about 3 o'clock, and that I request permission to introduce someone to her." The valet left the room. Albert threw himself on the divan, tore off the cover of 2 or 3 of the papers, looked at the theatre announcements, made a face seeing they gave an opera and not a ballet, hunted vainly amongst the advertisements for a new tooth-powder of which he had heard, and threw down, one after the other, the 3 leading papers of Paris, muttering, "These papers become more and more stupid every day." A moment after, a carriage stopped before the door, and the servant announced Monsieur Lucien Debray, a tall young man with light hair, clear gray eyes, and thin and compressed lips, dressed in a blue coat with beautifully carved gold buttons, a white neckcloth, and tortoise-shell eyeglass suspended by a silken thread, and which, by an effort of the superciliary and zygomatic muscles, he fixed in his eye, entered, with a half-official air, without smiling or speaking. "Good morning, Lucien. Good morning," said Albert. "Your punctuality really alarms me. What do I say? Punctuality? You whom I expected last, you arrive at 5 minutes to 10, when the time fixed was half past. Has the ministry resigned?" "No, my dear fellow," returned the young man, seating himself on the divan. "Reassure yourself. We are tottering always, but we never fall, and I begin to believe that we shall pass into a state of immobility, and then the affairs of the peninsula will completely consolidate us." "Ah, true. You drive Don Carlos out of Spain." "No, no, my dear fellow, do not confound our plans. We take him to the other side of the French frontier, and offer him hospitality at Bourges." "At Bourges?" "Yes. He has not much to complain of. Bourges is the capital of Charles VII. Do you not know that all Paris knew it yesterday, and the day before it had already transpired on the Bourse, and Monsieur Danglars, I do not know by what means that man contrives to obtain intelligence as soon as we do, made 1,000,000. And you another order, for I see you have a blue ribbon at your buttonhole." "Yes, they sent me the order of Charles III," returned Debray carelessly. "Come, do not affect indifference, but confess you were pleased to have it." "Oh, it is very well as a finish to the toilette." "It looks very neat on a black coat buttoned up." "It makes you resemble the Prince of Wales or the Duke of Reichstadt." "It is for that reason you see me so early, because you have the order of Charles III, and you wish to announce the good news to me." "No, because I passed the night writing letters, 25 dispatches. I returned home at daybreak and strove to sleep, but my head ached, and I got up to have a ride for an hour. At the Bois de Boulogne, ennui and hunger attacked me at once, two enemies who rarely accompany each other, and who are yet leagued against me, a sort of Carlo-Republican alliance. I then recollected you gave breakfast this morning, and here I am. I am hungry; feed me. I am bored; amuse me." "It is my duty as your host," returned Albert, ringing the bell, while Lucian turned over, with his gold-mounted cane, the papers that lay on the table. "Germain, a glass of sherry and a biscuit. In the meantime, my dear Lucian, here are cigars, contraband of course. Try them, and persuade the minister to sell us such instead of poisoning us with cabbage leaves." "Peste! I will do nothing of the kind. The moment they come from government you would find them execrable. Besides, that does not concern the home but the financial department. Address yourself to Monsieur Human, section of the indirect contributions, Corps A, No. 26. "On my word," said Albert, "you astonish me by the extent of your knowledge. Take a cigar." "Really, my dear Albert," replied Lucian, lighting a manila at a rose-colored taper that burned in a beautifully enamelled stand, "how happy you are to have nothing to do! You do not know your own good fortune." "And what would you do, my dear diplomatist," replied Morcerf, with a slight degree of irony in his voice, "if you did nothing? What? Private secretary to a minister, plunged at once into European cabals and Parisian intrigues, having kings, and better still, queens, to protect, parties to unite, elections to direct, making more use of your cabinet with your pen and your telegraph than Napoleon did of his battlefields with his sword and his victories, possessing 25,000 francs a year, besides your place, a horse, for which Chateau Renaud offered you 400 louis, and which you could not part with, a tailor who never disappoints you, with the opera, the jockey club, and other diversions. Can you not amuse yourself? Well, I will amuse you." "How?" "By introducing to you a new acquaintance. A man or a woman?" "A man." "I know so many men already." "But you do not know this man." "Where does he come from? The end of the world?" "Farther still, perhaps." "The deuce! I hope he does not bring our breakfast with him." "Oh, no. Our breakfast comes from my father's kitchen. Are you hungry?" "Humiliating as such a confession is, I am. But I dined at Monsieur de Villefort's, and lawyers always give you very bad dinners. You would think they felt some remorse. Did you ever remark that?" "Ah, depreciate other persons' dinners. You ministers give such splendid ones." "Yes, but we do not invite people of fashion. If we were not forced to entertain a parcel of country boobies because they think and vote with us, we should never dream of dining at home, I assure you." "Well, take another glass of sherry and another biscuit." "Willingly. Your Spanish wine is excellent. You see, we were quite right to pacify that country." "Yes, but Don Carlos?" "Well, Don Carlos will drink Bordeaux, and in 10 years we will marry his son to the little queen. You will then obtain the Golden Fleece, if you are still in the ministry. I think, Albert, you have adopted the system of feeding me on smoke this morning. Well, you must allow it is the best thing for the stomach. But I hear Beauchamp in the next room. You can dispute together, and that will pass away the time." "About what?" "About the papers." "My dear friend," said Lucian, with an air of sovereign contempt, "do I ever read the papers?" "Then you will dispute the more." "Monsieur Beauchamp," announced a servant. "Come in, come in," said Albert, rising and advancing to meet the young man. "Here is Debray, who detests you without reading you, so he says." "He is quite right," returned Beauchamp, "for I criticize him without knowing what he does. Good day, Commander." "Ah, you know that already," said the private secretary, smiling and shaking hands with him. "Pardieu!" "And what do they say of it in the world?" "In which world? We have so many worlds in the year of grace 1838." "In the entire political world, of which you are one of the leaders. They say that it is quite fair, and that sowing so much red, you ought to reap a little blue." "Come, come, that is not bad," said Lucian. "Why do you not join our party, my dear Beauchamp? With your talents you could make your fortune in 3 or 4 years. I only await one thing before following your advice, that is, a minister who will hold office for 6 months, my dear Albert. One word, for I must give poor Lucian a respite. Do we breakfast or dine? I must go to the Chamber, for our life is not an idle one." "You only breakfast. I await 2 persons, and the instant they arrive we shall sit down to table." Chapter 39.